Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer, where we are going to completely demystify one of the most notoriously tricky topics in nephrology, the glomerular hemodynamics of ureteral obstruction. If you've ever stared at Table 37.1 in Brenner's 11th edition and just felt your eyes glaze over at the endless shifting arrows of pressure and resistance, trust me, you are not alone. Today, we're acting as your digital whiteboard. We are going to map out the exact step-by-step mechanical changes that happen when a ureter gets blocked. We're going to focus heavily on the why behind those pressure shifts, entirely ditching the dense textbook jargon for simple, high-yield mechanics. So, grab your mental markers because we're about to master this table once and for all.
Here is our clinical timeline for this explainer. First, the baseline glomerulosis. Second, early unilateral ureteral obstruction, or UUO. Third, late UUO. Fourth, early bilateral obstruction, or BUO. Fifth, late BUO, which happens to contain a classic board exam trap. And finally, number 6, our hemodynamics cheat sheet.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the baseline glomerulus.
Before we can even begin to understand the pathology of an obstruction, we really need to know what a happy, unobstructed nephron looks like. To understand filtration at this baseline, we have to define 4 core variables. First up is RA, afferent arterial resistance. Think of this simply as the faucet controlling blood flow into the kidney. Second is PGC, the glomerular capillary pressure. This is your outward hydrostatic pressure, the force actively pushing fluid through the filter. Third is PT, the proximal tubule pressure. This is the fluid pressure out in Bowman space, pushing back against the filtration. And finally, SNGFR, the single nephron glomerular filtration rate. This is our net result, the actual amount of fluid successfully filtered. Now normally, PGC easily overcomes that PT back pressure, and SNGFR just hums along perfectly.
Moving right along to Section 2, early unilateral obstruction, looking specifically at the 1 to 3 hour mark.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is exactly what happens the second things go wrong. Imagine a sudden jagged kidney stone completely blocking a single ureter. It physically blocks antegrade urine flow, so fluid just starts backing up. And it backs up all the way into Bowman space, which causes our proximal tubule pressure, or PT, to dramatically spike. Logically, if the pressure pushing back against the filter spikes like that, you'd probably expect filtration to immediately grind to a halt, right? But it doesn't. SNGFR actually stays relatively unchanged at first. So the question is, why does capillary pressure paradoxically rise to match that backup?
The answer is an incredible intrinsic rescue mechanism. During those first 1 to 3 hours, the kidney detects the blockage and locally releases vasodilator prostaglandins. These prostaglandins act directly on the afferent arteriole, effectively ripping the faucet wide open. This means RA, our afferent resistance, goes down. This massive vasodilation allows a surge of blood to rush in, triggering a temporary paradoxical increase in renal blood flow and glomerular capillary pressure, PGC. This hyperemic response drives PGC up so high that it literally matches the elevated PT pressure, keeping our SNGFR effectively unchanged for the time being. It's a brilliant, though definitely temporary, compensatory reflex.
Which brings us to Section 3, late unilateral obstruction, covering the 3 to 24 hour window.
Because, let's face it, the kidney can only maintain this high-pressure standoff for so long. We are looking at a very strict phase-dependent timeline here. By the 3-hour mark, that initial prostaglandin-driven hyperemia begins to fade out. The intrarenal environment shifts completely. Inflammatory leukocytes like macrophages migrate into the obstructed kidney, and instead of those helpful vasodilators, the kidney starts churning out potent vasoconstrictors.
The main culprits taking over here are angiotensin II and thromboxane A2, or TXA2. They dominate the local environment, causing massive afferent vasoconstriction. Because of this, afferent resistance, RA, shoots way up. The faucet is now clamped tightly shut, meaning renal blood flow practically plummets. Without that blood flow, our glomerular capillary pressure, PGC, absolutely crashes, and because PGC is crashed, our single nephron GFR goes right down with it. By 24 hours in a unilateral obstruction, filtration is profoundly depressed simply because the afferent arteriole is essentially strangling its own blood supply.
Now for Section 4, early bilateral obstruction, looking again at the 1 to 3 hour mark.
Let's reset our clock back to the 1 to 3 hour mark, but this time, let's introduce bilateral ureteral obstruction. Both ureters are blocked. Does the kidney respond the exact same way? The answer is a resounding no. And this is a vital distinction to understand. In early UUO, we saw that beautiful prostaglandin-driven vasodilation, but in early bilateral obstruction, that hyperemic response is almost completely absent. Why? Because when both sides are blocked, systemic factors and a powerful reflex called the reno-renal nerve reflex kick in instantly. Increased afferent renal nerve traffic triggers rapid vasoconstrictive efferent signals that completely override any of those local vasodilators. So in early BUO, instead of vasodilation, you get immediate profound afferent vasoconstriction.
This brings us to Section 5, Late Bilateral Obstruction, the 24-hour mark, the board trap.
And this brilliantly illustrates the climax of our explainer. This specific time point is a classic, heavily tested medical board exam trap, probably because question writers just love to inflict a little physiological pain on us. At 24 hours in a bilateral obstruction, if you measure the glomerular capillary pressure, PGC, it actually normalizes. It is completely unchanged from baseline. But filtration? It's still completely halted. As seen, GFR is practically zero. So if PGC is totally normal, why on earth isn't the nephron filtering?
The secret here lies entirely in the volume status. Because both ureters are blocked, the body is retaining volume, urea, and atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. These systemic factors actually vasodilate the clamped afferent arteriole right back to its normal baseline. So afferent resistance returns to normal, and PGC returns to normal. But, and here is the trap, the single nephron GFR remains deeply depressed purely because the proximal tubular pressure, PT, is so massively elevated. The physical backup of urine is pushing back so incredibly hard that a perfectly normal capillary pressure simply can't overcome it. Filtration is halted by extreme back pressure, not by a lack of blood flow.
Let's wrap things up with Section 6, the Hemodynamics cheat sheet. Table 37.1 simplified.
So the crucial point is this. If you want a screenshot-worthy summary, you just need to memorize these distinct phases. In early UUO, at the 1 to 2 hour mark, prostaglandins rule. PGE is way up, but RA drops, so PGC spikes, which keeps SNGFR completely unchanged. In late UUO at 24 hours, angiotensin II and thromboxane rule. Afferent resistance shoots way up, starving the glomerulus. PGC drops and SNGFR crashes down. And finally, in late BUO at 24 hours, our classic board trap. Because of systemic volume retention, RA normalizes and PGC normalizes, but PGE remains massively elevated, single-handedly crushing the SNGFR.
By understanding the why behind all these arrows, the prostaglandins, the vasoconstrictors, and the systemic reflexes, you really no longer have to blindly memorize this table. You can mechanically build it from scratch in your head. So how will you spot the difference between the early hyperemic phase and the late PT pressure trap on your next board question or clinical rotation? Just remember to trace the physics of the flow. Keep asking why the pressure is shifting, and the physiology will always reveal the answer. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and keep staying curious.